Coming up on Chopper's Political Podcast.
Will Keir Starmer take us back into the European Union? Yes or no?
Next 5 years, if he wins again, I think he very well could.
Welcome back to Chopper's Political Podcast, where I bring you the best guests, gossip and stories from the heart of our studio here in Westminster. My guest this week is a former Conservative Minister, Lord Frost, David Frost. He's a former British diplomat and a civil servant. He's well known to GB News viewers and listeners as one of the architects of the Brexit deal and a staunch right-winger who, for whatever reason, was not able to stand in last month's general election. More of that later. David Frost, welcome to Chopper's Political Podcast.
Great to be here.
Great to have you here. Can I ask you a quick question, just briefly? Why did the Tories lose the election? An easy one.
Gosh, briefly. Lots of things went wrong, obviously. The reasons are quite deep. I think a mix of things, really. Not delivering the benefits of Brexit, most obviously immigration, looking a bit embarrassed by Brexit, not delivering the change that people wanted. I think the leadership issue, the kind of campaigning against Liz Truss that went on, I don't think that helped.
You were pro-Trussite, weren't you?
I was. Obviously, she didn't get everything right, but I think what people heard from the campaigning against Truss was your party made a terrible mistake and we're all paying for it. And I think it didn't really help. We drifted left. The party's offer became unclear. All those things went together. So I think by the time the election was called, we were bound to lose.
And would it have worked hang on till November? I mean, look at all the good news in quotes is happening, ticking up economy, inflation hitting 2%, probably a fall in net migration shortly in official figures, and so it goes on.
I mean, I don't think it would have made any difference if I'm honest. I mean, we don't know how things are going to play out. We don't know. I mean, I personally think the small boats bill that's now been scrapped probably wouldn't have done the job anyway.
That's Rwanda.
That's Rwanda. So we would have been dealing with that. Who knows what else? I'm afraid I think the British people had decided they had had enough of our, how to put it, eccentric mix of high taxes and inability to deal with the country's problems.
You were almost like John the Baptist in the wilderness because you resigned over high taxes, didn't you, from Boris Johnson's cabinet?
Yeah, I mean, I felt we were going the wrong way towards the end of 2021. I mean, the thing that forced me out was, of course, COVID and an attempt to do another lockdown and vaccine passports and all of that. But it was, I'm afraid, obvious that we were drifting and not giving our voters what they wanted, even at that point.
And do you blame Brexit? You mentioned Brexit there. I mean, for me, Brexit is like the weather. It's a condition. You can't blame Brexit for high immigration or Brexit for anything. Brexit is the condition which the British people have bequeathed to politicians, and it's how you use that power, which is the point.
Totally. Before we left, we didn't have power to change a lot of things, and we had to live with that, and some things worked and some things didn't. Now we've got a different mix. We are, with the exception of Northern Ireland, sadly, in charge of our own affairs. It's up to us to try and deliver on that. And the failure has come from governments, civil servants, machinery of government that has simply not
done it.
What people want.
Well, in fact, said we'll cut immigration at two elections. I think, certainly 17 and 19 we'll cut immigration. That never happened. And the point now is you can't hide behind Brussels and say, well, it's the EU, freedom of movement, sorry, mate. It's all down on this government, isn't it? And essentially it failed to do what it said it would do, and a new lot have come in.
I think the British establishment sort of, how to put this, fell out of the habit of governing Britain while we're in the EU. They outsourced choices. They kind of allowed, it was always too easy to shuffle off responsibility, and we forgot how to do it.
About a third of laws were decided in Brussels, weren't they? And then everyone hid behind that kind of the apron strings of Brussels on big choices.
Absolutely. And now we're back in charge. The British governing establishment is back in charge of the country, and they've forgotten how to run a country.
And a lesson might be to do what you'll say you'll do and do it. I mean, don't just not do it.
Well, that definitely,
for example,
definitely helps. Absolutely, on migration. But you've got to do that, of course, you've got to have a clear philosophy. You've got to know what you want to do. You've got to stick to it. It's got to be your kind of lodestar when you're in government and all this stuff is coming at you and there are all these problems. You've got to have something that guides you, that says, we're going to focus on this, we're going to do this, we're not going to do this. And of course, we didn't really have that.
Well, I mean, I think on immigration, migration, they are bang to rights, the last Tory government. On taxation, Ukraine happened, the energy shock. COVID wasn't expected, £400 billion of that. Do you forgive the government on tax, the last government?
I don't really, to be honest. I mean, obviously a lot of debt went on, and the debt is high. That is the way it is, and we're going to have to pay that down and grow the economy. But that didn't mean that taxes had to be raised in the short run. There's always another option. There's always cutting spending. That's how you get the economy to grow and how you reduce the burden of debt. So I'm afraid we kind of forgot about our USP.
You as a Tory party.
Yes, we collectively as a Tory party, at a time when the tax burden is already extremely high, to be taking the easy way out of raising it further. That was a mistake.
And Boris Johnson was a Tory, wasn't he?
He was a Tory.
Yeah, he was a Tory. He's weak on migration, and also pretty weak on taxation too.
I mean, I know. If you look back, for example, at Boris's speech when he, between being Foreign Secretary and being Prime Minister at the Tory Party conference 2018, it's a beautiful speech. It's beautiful, sort of free market, liberal, cut taxes, get the economy growing, all that sort of thing. We just unfortunately failed to deliver it. Of course there were headwinds. Of course there was COVID. Of course there was Ukraine. Of course there was those things. But
and Partygate, of course, some personal
all
discipline.
those kind of things. But if you don't have the principles, then you inevitably wander off into the thickets, and that's what happened.
And is Thatcherism almost a dirty word now, in the sense that it was used as a kind of lodestar, as you said, didn't you, under Haig and through the noughties, and then Cameron moved away from it, didn't he, by saying the NHS is sacrosanct, and then Osborne trying to go back towards it, the Lib Dems got in the way, and then since then it's been Brexit.
I mean, I guess it depends what you mean by Thatcherism. I think
small state, low tax.
Small state, low tax, but also the nation, standing up for the nation, a degree of sort of positive patriotism and nationalism, control the borders, spending on defence, standing up for things in the world, a government that actually did the job. And she did both of those things, actually. And so she's sometimes caricatured as just a kind of libertarian, whereas I don't think that was really Thatcherism at all. What we've got to do is get back to this. I don't always think it helps to call it Thatcherism, because that was then, this is now. The challenges are somewhat different, but the principles are the same.
I mean, looking forward now, do you think left or right divisions even matter in the Tory party anymore? Really?
I think they do. They are, how to put it, I think there is definitely a kind of soft left liberal fringe, I'm afraid, in the Conservative Party in Parliament that might be
more than the fringe. I think
maybe, I don't know how many now, but some of them might be happier in a different party. I feel. I do.
How many MPs?
I mean, I don't
Just
know.
You and me
now.
talking.
I don't know.
10, a dozen,
maybe 10, a dozen, maybe less than that. Actually, I would perhaps say nowadays, but a small number. Beyond that, I think there's quite a lot of kind of unity. The arguments are about tactics as much as substance. I mean, I don't think there's anybody in the Tory party really who actually likes high taxes. It's just that there's a temptation to choose it as the easy way out all the time.
It's always easy, isn't it? Because it's harder cutting spending. And being tough on the state is hard when you've got everyone around you is employed by the state, and being that person to say to the room, I'm so sorry, there are too many of you here, let's remove spending.
It is really difficult. I mean, suppose you want to take £1 billion out of public spending, which is basically nothing. It's it's about 0.1% of
the rounding error.
Yeah, that means taking £1,000 off 1 million people. That is a sense of the political difficulty of making even small cuts in spending. So that's why it's difficult. All the same, spending is much, much too high. It's nearly half of GDP. We've got to find a way of getting it down.
Well, it's Labour's problem now, but let's just stick with the Tories for now. Who do you want to win the leadership election?
So I'm supporting Rob Jenrick. I think he is the. I mean, there are a number of good candidates.
Quite a strong candidate, I think.
I think so, and all standing for recognisably conservative things, different places on the spectrum. But the reason I've gone with Rob and why I think he's the right person for me to support is really two things. One, he's the one I think who most gets the sense of what went wrong and the need for a fundamental look both at the party and at the policy offer, going right back to the beginning, working out what needs to be done, really taking the time to address that so we can get the country on a different path.
He's a strong enough performer in Parliament. I mean, he's one of the weaker dispatch box performers, I'd say, of them all.
I don't know. I think it depends what you want.
What matters? Well, yeah. Who are you electing? A leader of the opposition or the next prime minister? That's the question you've got to work out.
That's exactly the right way to put it. It's very easy to make sort of shots at people, and let's not forget William Hague actually was a pretty good parliamentary opponent. Didn't do him any good.
Zero impact on the ball, a bit on the polls, but not a lot.
Yeah, so that's the problem. The other reason I support Rob is that he stood on principle. You mentioned that I resigned on principle, well, so did he. And
yes.
I think standing for what you think, not going along with everything, and taking a stand is important.
And what he resigned on mattered. He resigned on immigration.
Yes.
On that, and I would argue, up to you to argue, but maybe taxation and immigration are the two big, let's call them lodestars, sort of magnetic points that will define the next 5 years for the Tory party.
I think so, and they're kind of symbolic. That's why taxation is symbolic of getting the economy right and growing and all the things you need to do that. And immigration is symbolic of, do we actually run this country, or can anybody just wander in?
Yeah, is there control over not or not?
Yeah.
Robert Jenrick, and is he left or right? I mean, it's a good question to ask. I'm not entirely sure on the answer.
So I think...
And does it matter anyway?
He should speak for himself, obviously, but I think he's been on a journey,
yes.
And many of us...
A Remainer on a journey.
Yeah, I mean, lots of people have kind of changed their mind as they've seen how things have developed. And, I certainly saw when I was in government how people attempted to block Brexit, and it certainly radicalised me. And I think his experience on immigration and dealing with the Home Office and all of that's had the same kind of effect on him. Certainly when I talk to him, that's the sense I get of
yes.
somebody who's really driven and determined to do things differently next time. We wish we really must.
And Boris Johnson can be part of that? Maybe make him a peer, put him in a House of Lords with you?
I mean, why not?
Why not?
Rob is has commented on that, and Boris is a great campaigner. I kind of feel we've not quite seen the last of Boris in British public
and
life.
You know him pretty well, don't you? You worked very closely with him, didn't you?
We did over the years, and I loved working with Boris. I thought he was a remarkable person in many ways. And it'd be a pity to lose him entirely.
Could he be leader again?
I think it's difficult, to be honest. I think the party wants to move on.
Yes.
We've got to look forward. We
okay, so looking forward, again, still on the Tory party, Nigel Farage, the Reform UK party, that's a challenge. 4 million votes went to Reform at last month's election. What do? Do you ignore them? Do you go towards them? Do you go towards them and move away from them? How do you get them back?
Well, we've got to push out policies in a credible way. We've got to look credible, like we're actually going to do it. We're not just saying it, but we believe it as a party. We've got to push out such policies in a worldview that are the kind of things that Reform have been saying, and get back some of those voters. It isn't about tactics. It's about what does the party stand for. And we know that most of those who went to Reform were former Conservative voters, people who just didn't think that we were pushing Conservative policies. And if you look at the Reform manifesto, that was a pretty good Conservative manifesto. And I know a lot of Conservatives who wish it had been our manifesto. So that's the kind of...
They had straightforward, maybe naive answers to difficult questions. Yeah. So what struck me was interesting was that the Tory government had identified the problem, stopped the boats, cut spending, but they didn't have an answer on them. So Reform UK went on one in, one out on net migration, which most people say is impossible because of the needs of the labour market, cutting spending by, I think, 5%, just cut it by 5%. Richard Tice would say, just cut it. These are high bars to aim for, but of course people thought, well, what are the Tories going to do? They're just going to carry on more of the same. Let's go for someone who says they'll do something different.
That's it. I mean, we were trying to have it all ways a bit, obviously, and tilt both left and to the right, and it was just not really credible in the end. And I think, as I was saying earlier, you've got to have things you actually believe in and want to do. And if you don't start off by saying we really want to cut spending, we really want to hold immigration to zero, then you're definitely not going to do it in government. That is for sure. You've got to have a clear set of principles to start off with.
What's your position on the Farage question? Should he be allowed into the party? Is there a merger to happen here, or some kind of deal with them, an electoral pact or some sort?
I mean, the Farage question itself, it doesn't seem. I mean, he's obviously a recognisably conservative figure, as far as I can see. As far as I can see, he's not asking to join the party, so it's not a kind of live question. What I do think is that we cannot have another election where the right is divided and where true right voters, true conservatives, have to go somewhere else or just decide not to vote. We're doomed to lose.
So how do you yes, that's a problem. How do you square that problem? And do you do an electoral pact so you don't stand against each other? Do you say, what do you do with the Farage question? You got to neutralise him somehow.
Well, what I hope is going to happen over the next few years is we're going to do enough policy work and bring enough people into the party and push out a credible enough view that it will start to bring back reform voters, and you'll see a natural kind of convergence. The question of do you have an electoral pact? That's a question for 4 or 5 years time, I think.
And you hope to be part of any new shadow cabinet if in the future you want to have it back in, because you were writing these trenchant opinion pieces and in the Telegraph and then talking to GB News here and there, but you want to be back on the front line.
I'd like to be back on the front line. What sort of role that's up to others, and I certainly wouldn't say anything about that. But what I do think is that the unusual thing for me is I've spent most of my life in government, and most politicians haven't. I've been a civil servant, I've been a special advisor, I've been a minister. I know how the machine works, and I think we can get it to do things. And over Brexit, I succeeded in doing that. So I would like to I feel very strongly that the country has got onto the wrong path and is going to carry on going down the wrong path unless people kind of stand up and say no and try and change it. And that's what I've been trying to do.
Is the blob correct that Liz Truss talks about, this blob obstructing change, obstructing the right, this kind of left of centre blob trying to stop the right getting its way in government?
Well, I think there's a bit of it. I'm a bit of a sceptic about the blob myself. I think, it's more that the civil service is kind of softish left by inclination, because those are the kind of people who go and work in the public sector in the first place. I think very often they're just not very capable and skilled to an extent that people don't realise. It's changed a lot over the 30 years I was in the civil service. And if you look at the scandal at the moment over Keir Starmer and his team trying to put in their donors,
political appointees, yeah.
I mean, you have to laugh really, because they spent the last few years telling us that we were kind of the only reason the civil service wouldn't deliver was because we were asking them to do outrageous, illegal, shocking things. And then as soon as they get in, it turns out they've got no confidence in the civil service either. They want their own people in it.
But you can't rely on a handful of 25-year-old spads to get your way in Whitehall. You need to have allies around you. The Tories tried to do it. They got obstructed and complained about by Labour. Now Labour are trying to do it. That's what's happening.
That's what's happening. And they know just as much as we do that the machine isn't working, and they want their own people in it. And I think, if they had come out and said, we're not so sure this machine is particularly good, we think we ought to have some political appointees, and here they are, and we make the case for them. Okay, you can agree or disagree, but it's an argument. But to do it like pretending not to be doing it and pretending this sort of moral purity about the system while doing it, I don't think that is really right.
Well, Sir Keir Starmer has said in his press conference in the Downing Street Garden that he says, it's the Tories complaining about it, I'm not going to even go there. So he won't even address the cause.
Which just seems, they've been hoping it'll go away, and it hasn't.
I'm not sure it will.
I credit Henry Newman here.
Yes,
I haven't
former
always
advisor
on everything.
Yeah,
he's done a great job on this, and I think clearly Labour have been hoping it would go away before Parliament came back, but I don't think it's going to.
Well, it's building up, and I think there'll be an inquiry by the Public Affairs Committee, which monitors appointments. Yeah. For me, as an observer, and I've been around it for 20 years or plus, I think the dam will burst on a story when they appoint a politician to the role of our man in Washington. Mm. I think if that happens, if they go for David Miliband, if they go for Peter Mandelson, then suddenly everything else starts to matter a lot more, just for the wider public.
That probably makes it kind of a recognisable story. Of course, in a way, it would be odd because ambassadors is kind of recognised. There have been political appointees. Labour's done it in the past. We've done it. There is a understanding you can do it.
Was it Peter Jay? Was it back in to Callaghan's?
Peter Jay to Washington, but
late 70s.
Paul Boateng was ambassador, High Commissioner of South Africa under Blair. There were one or two others. We have had one or two sort of much less prominent political.
David Cameron's former chief of staff was made
exactly.
in Paris.
So it does happen.
But when it's a big figure, when it's a former actual elected politician, like if it goes that scale, I think I
think people will understand.
People will think the problem. I'm going to ask you quickly, before we go on to Labour, about yourself. Why aren't you an MP?
Well, I mean, it didn't work out.
You and me chatting here.
I was on the. I was on the list. The Conservative Party,
a 1,000-strong list of candidates,
who can be put forward, and then I was taken off it, or rather deferred from the ability to apply at the start of the year. I've never been told really why, though I can guess.
But why? I mean, were you too conservative? I mean, were you too trenchant in your views on the leadership?
I think I was probably. Well, I never called for Rishi to go, actually, although my private view is that it would have been better if he had. That's water under the bridge now, but that wasn't the issue. I think I was just too trenchant a critic too often, and I don't know whether you remember, there was that big opinion poll at the start of the year, which was one of the first ones.
Were you part of that?
Well, I wrote it up in the Telegraph, so I got kind of associated with it, and I think what
was the truth of that now? Who was the donor who paid for it? Has that ever been announced?
That will have to remain shrouded
you
in mystery
won't say who it was
forever. I can't say who that was, but I was involved in writing it up rather than being involved in the poll. But I think that was probably
because that was seen as an attack on Number 10 by them, even despite it was trying to be helpful, I think.
We were trying to make people realise, get out of this complacency, and of course that particular poll, showed us doing much better than we actually did.
Yes.
So we were trying to get people to see disaster is coming, and unfortunately we failed to persuade people.
You saw the iceberg, but you still hit it.
Yeah, exactly.
And so therefore, I
was taken off.
You were taken off the list,
to apply for seats, and then.
Well, the PM told me, didn't he, on the flight over to tour from Belfast on a campaign, that you're not being blocked.
Yes. At that moment, I was not being blocked, but up to that point, I definitely was. But it was really too late. It was the start of the election campaign. Most of the seats had been sewn up. Yes. They had plans for most of them, so it just couldn't work out. And I'd probably not have won a seat looking at what happened anyway.
And you'd quit the House of Lords to do that.
Yes.
Could you have gone back to after standing, or you're out the door, you've gone?
Well,
what the rules?
The legislation's ambiguous, but probably you've got to stand down like at the start of the campaign or as soon as
and then stop being a peer.
Yeah,
and you couldn't go back in if you lost.
You can't go back. It's specifically precluded.
So it may have worked out for you, David Frost. It may have worked out.
It may have. But it's not over yet. There
are
future opportunities.
Well, indeed, there's future elections, of course, 2028, 2029. Do you want to stand then?
I mean, let's see where we are by then. But certainly, I'd be interested. And of course, there are by-elections, though there are no doubt a lot of, sadly, good defeated Conservative MPs who also would like to come back into by-election. And
the slight duty of care, you think, amongst the 22, they try and look after their own, particularly MPs who are suddenly leaving office very shortly, because they're on the earn out now. They're not quite out, I think, on the notice period runs till I think notice period runs till about Easter, I think,
something like that.
And then they really are. They need help, don't they? So they may come first.
So we'll see.
We'll see.
Commons is where things happen.
We are now with a Labour government for the next probably 5 years, given the scale of their majority. Will Keir Starmer take us back into the European Union? Yes or no?
In this 5 years, no, I don't think so.
And then in the next 5 years?
Next 5 years, if he wins again, I think he very well could.
Wow.
In this 5 years, I think he would like to get as close as he possibly could. And of course, they've denied they want to go back into the customs union and the single market. But these things, the single market is just a selection of, it's a term of art for lots and lots of separate policies of integration. He's already talked about doing some of those, a food and veterinary agreement, a chemicals agreement. Well, you do a lot of those and you're starting to get into the single market. I'm sure that's what they would like to do. Defence agreements, security agreements.
So by the end, you're basically there, you're de facto there after all those little...
Gone, yeah. You've started to go back in. That you are depriving yourself of the benefits, the ability to do anything differently, because you're kind of beginning to be locked into their system. And crucially, psychologically, a lot of the British establishment hasn't psychologically left the EU. There's still the first question they still ask themselves: what are the Europeans going to do? What does Brussels think about things? And every time you're closely associated, you are back in, as Boris said, you're back in the tractor beam. You're sort of pulled back to what are they doing the whole time, rather than making your own mind up about what's in the interests of this country.
The first step then will be the renegotiation of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which is, I think, next year or sort of the year after. The next starts anyway next year. What will you be looking? What's the betrayal you're looking for in those conversations? You mentioned there veterinary, food. Is fish being sold down the river?
I mean, I'm no doubt
fish
will be part of the conversation the EU want to have on this, because the fish transition period comes to an end.
They're all our waters after that, aren't
that's they? Right, in the middle of 2026. And at that point, it's up to us. And, we can close it all off if we want. And no doubt the EU don't want that to happen. So I'm sure that's going to be part of it. They will try and make us pay some other price if we insist on doing that. So it'll all be part of a big negotiation. Yeah. And I worry that Labour will be too willing to pay the price of whether it's fish, whether it's accepting EU laws and the court in certain areas again, all these things, they just don't seem to care about national independence and national self-determination.
They say they do. They say they do. Keir Starmer says he does. He says
but we know he doesn't.
Single market customs union. Yeah, well, we know from his time as Corbyn's Brexit spokesman.
That's right. We know. I mean, if you've only got to look at Labour MPs, look at their background. Most of them, they love the European Union. They regard it as a sort of, terrible distortion of history that somehow we decided to get out. And of course, they all want to find ways of going back.
He calls it populism, doesn't he? I mean, it might be a deal under 30s, freedom of movement. That would be a trade-off for some fishing rights going. That could be sorts of.
We've done freedom of movement deals with other non-EU countries. I would say that doesn't cross a line of principle, as long as you don't accept the court or EU laws or anything. What it does cross is a line of, is this a sensible thing to do or not? And when people are very worried about immigration, it doesn't seem like it's a very sensible thing to do at all.
Yes. So things to watch out for in terms of Brexit being watered down is the big deals on, as you say, on the trade areas.
It's the trade. It's do they accept EU law without a say? Do they accept the court without a say? Do they accept that we can't change our own laws in particular areas unless the EU says so? Those are the things that start pulling you back in and making it very difficult to change.
Is there a think tank yet doing this work? Is there a body watching Brexit?
So,
and will you run one if there isn't one? You seem pretty engaged by it all.
I've definitely remained deeply involved in this. I think, the Brexit, one of the side effects, I would say, of the Sunak government kind of looking a bit embarrassed by Brexit and doing all sorts of, terrible Northern Ireland deal, giving up on the retained EU law change and all that, is that the defence of Brexit rested in a few commentators and bloggers and people on Twitter trying to make the case. It's a very fragmented scene because we didn't think we needed it. We thought we'd done it and we had a government that would deliver it. And by the time we realised that wasn't the case, people had gone off to do other things. So you're right, there needs to be a coming together, I think, and reminding people why.
What's called Brexit Central post the referendum, perhaps Brexit Watch. Will you be the Brexit Watchdog?
Something like that is definitely needed to remind people what we're at risk of losing.
Do you think the word Brexit is banned by the government? I only say that because I don't see it being used ever anymore. The word Brexit isn't.
Brexit, yeah. I think it has its pros and cons. I mean, it's just that I'm not a huge fan of it myself in some
No.
ways because what we're actually talking about is national independence,
Yes.
the same rights that every other non-EU country in the world has to set its own laws, run its own rules, national freedom, national independence, national self-determination. That's what it's about. Brexit kind of it's a term of art and it kind of avoids that point. Yes. If you say to people, do you want to undo Brexit? They kind of, maybe they'll hum and ha a bit about it. If you say, do you think Britain shouldn't set its own laws? Do you think it shouldn't be an independent country? It makes it a lot clearer what's actually at stake.
So you're not a fan of the word Brexit, but you like Brexit.
I like it. It's maybe the world has moved on a bit in terms of the word.
Should the UK leave the ECHR, the European Convention on Human Rights? I mean,
I think we're going to have to. I've been on the same journey a bit as Robert Jenrick here.
He says we're out. I mean, other candidates who sat in your same chair as you say, let's just say no in certain areas. I think Tom Tugendhat says that. Like on prisoner voting, we say we're not going to abide by you on prisoner voting, for example.
I mean, the problem is, of course, if you try and overrule bits of the ECHR in our own law, then most people will say, well, you are effectively leaving it. You're not abiding by the treaty, and you get into a tangle over this whole question of international law and domestic law. I think it's easier just to pull the plug, and I really regret it in a way. If you'd asked me 5 years ago, I would have said I hope we could have avoided this, but it seems to me that we're just never going to be able to get back control unless we assert
it goes
this.
to the heart of sovereignty, doesn't it? That's the point.
Yeah,
like the word Brexit is about sovereignty, and so is the issue with the court. It's a sovereignty issue.
It is
a UK court sovereignty.
Yes, and unfortunately, it's always been the case. It just looks like the court is getting more and more assertive in areas that really matter to people. That's the problem. In a way, moving the EU off the scene has exposed quite how much influence the ECHR has, and quite how much over immigration in particular, which is obviously the top issue.
Critics say, of course, sort of despotic regimes pull out the ECHR or aren't in it in the first place. Do we want to ally ourselves with those countries? I mean, and how can we lecture other countries about human rights, like China, for example, when we have pulled out the ECHR?
I mean, we can perfectly well run our own human rights arrangements. We always did before the ECHR. America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand don't accept foreign courts telling them what to do in their own domestic law. And I just think in Europe, we've fallen into this habit, whether it's the EU, whether it's the ECHR, that countries can't govern themselves. You need these kind of platonic guardians outside the country telling you what to do all the time. And you don't. You just need to break the spell.
It's a confidence issue as a country, a confidence issue. Yeah. Stand tall and back yourself, and don't feel you have to rely on a foreign court.
That's right.
EU, ECHR.
Break the spell, pull away the curtain, and govern yourselves.
Well, here's something else. The net zero target 2050. Should that be delayed?
I think
we're an outlier, aren't we? That's quite an early date compared to other countries. I think I think
the Europeans are 2050. Quite a lot around the world are a little bit later. I think we probably will have to delay it in the end. I think the risk, if you don't delay it, is you just get more and more problems. But of course, that means it's in domestic legislation, so you have to confront the question. I think that it's too fast. It imposes too high costs too quickly and forces an energy transition that we're not ready for. And I think the debate has already changed, actually, I would say, over the last year or so, and it's continuing to change. So,
although it's been brought back into stark relief by the Labour government, they've said new petrol vehicles can't be sold after 2030 now, not 2035, as Rishi Sunak brought in, watering down what Boris Johnson did. Yeah, but it's a worry, isn't it, for many? I mean, there was never actually a vote on net zero. It was brought in by an SI, by Theresa May at the end of her government. I remember vividly the battle with Philip Hammond as Chancellor, I think, behind the scenes, saying it's going to cost us billions.
Yes.
So there's never been a vote on this, ever, by anybody.
2 or 3 MPs spoke against it, but there was no vote.
No.
Peter Lilly.
Should there be a referendum on net zero?
I think there
get
is room
buy-in
for
by the country?
more referendums than we've got used to. I think they're better on purely constitutional affairs. I think it's better to have the argument. But the problem is, if every party is advocating the same policy, then inevitably people go for referenda as the way out of the
It's a rubber
problem,
stamp.
as we did in over Brexit. And what I hope is that the Conservative Party in opposition, as Reform did, looks at this a bit more carefully, and in particular moves away from this fantasy of wind and solar power that are just not ready. They're not suitable for this country. They don't deliver power when we need it. They're expensive.
When the wind stops blowing, the sun stops shining.
You need a backup for it for those. It's pushing up costs. And if you want to do net zero, we know how to do it. It's modern gas power stations and it's nuclear, and that's what we should focus on building, because then you get actual power when you want it as well, which is good.
And not reliant on foreign suppliers, as we saw over Ukraine and Russia.
And I'm worried actually about the extent to which our energy policy now relies on interconnectors with Europe. I still remember the French threatening to cut off the interconnectors to Jersey in 2021. Yes. I saw it as a different case, but let's remember the vaccine wars and, the arguments over, could we make vaccines in Europe and get them to the UK? I just have a lower level of trust, really. I think on something like your own energy supplies, you should be in proper charge of them.
Yes. Perhaps a referendum on leaving the ECHR.
Could be. I think if there's, a genuine argument about it, one party argues one thing, another argues one thing, and it's clearly an issue in an election, then that's one thing. If it's a way of, I think the case for a referendum on the ECHR is this question of the permanent state, the kind of legal state, the, in inverted commas, blob, though, as I said, I'm a bit sceptical about it. If you won the election, if you've got a referendum on it, then it's clear it's got to happen. And that is sort of a way of strengthening the arm of the government. So I wouldn't rule it out, but I don't really see it as essential.
Freedom of speech, is that under threat under Labour? That's been said by those on the right, that they worry about what you can say and what you can't say. I mean, we think in GB News here, those dreadful riots all are condemned by everybody, but there's a concern about the people who worry immigration are called the far right by this leadership of this government, and that isn't the case for those who feel that way.
I mean, the problem is that we've got quite a lot of laws on our statute book already that can be used to clamp down on freedom of speech. The Communications Act goes back a couple of decades now. It's about sending a grossly offensive message. For example, the new Online Safety Act that says you can't send a false message. Well, says who? Says what's false, what's true. There's quite a lot of stuff already there, and I think under the Conservative government there were enough it was enough in the DNA, though weakly, as we saw during the COVID period, it was enough in the DNA that you kind of didn't use those laws really to clamp down on free speech. Labour doesn't seem to care about that, so they've got all this legislation that they can already use. I think they would like to toughen up the Online Safety Act for this legal and harmful concept, but there's plenty of things they can do already. So yeah, I do really worry about it, because it just doesn't seem to be something they care about very much, which is odd. Historically, freedom of speech has been a kind of left-wing issue. People should be able to say what they think, and judges and governments and bosses shouldn't be able to stop you saying what you want. But it seems to have turned around.
It's
completely.
Exhausting. There's nothing. The US have their constitution. We don't have that here, do we? So these things that you might think can't be touched, you got to be vigilant for them.
They rely on a culture.
A culture
a
issue.
culture of belief that people should be able to say what they think. And I always say, when I was much younger, I remember my parents, if they disagreed with somebody, they'd end up saying, well, it's a free country.
Yeah.
In other words, you can say what you think.
That's
and
it.
People don't say that anymore. And
No.
I don't think it's coincidence. I think people are careful about what they say. They do worry that certain opinions are beyond the pale, and the boundaries of those opinions keep shrinking. And that is a problem.
I mean, is it wrong to bang people up for several years in jail or a few years in jail because of what's been said on Twitter, social media, as we've seen in recent weeks?
Depends what's said. I mean, incitement to violence is a crime. It always has been, as never. Free speech advocates have always accepted that. In the US, there's got to be a pretty close connection between what you say and the proposed act of violence. And what we've had in this country is people sort of essentially sounding off. It's not really clear they're kind of really advocating violence. No. I wish they wouldn't do it. I think it'd be much better if they didn't do it.
Just put the phone down and move away. And
is it really incitement in that sense? I think sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't, and it comes down to the clarity. What it shows is we don't have the clarity in our own legislation. It depends what the government thinks and what the authorities think, and that is damaging because it means you don't know what you can say.
Has it gone too far in recent weeks, do you think? Has it gone too far in recent weeks?
I think it probably has a bit. Some of the cases that people have highlighted I'm less concerned about than others, but I do think there have been cases where people have kind of said things that are sort of inappropriate, but not more than that. And a confident society ought to be able to deal with inappropriate discussion. Yeah.
Right. So here we are. We're 6-7 weeks after the election, looking forward into the next 5 years. You're a Conservative. You want to be part of the action going forward. Are you worried about the 5 years ahead, or do you think?
Yeah. I mean, I am worried. I think, the problem is that Labour do not have, as far as I can see, they don't have a clear philosophy of where they want to take the country. I think they feel that their only problem is that they weren't in charge. They think now everything will be okay because we've got sensible Labour people in charge, not these terrible,
like small boats being a case in point.
Yes, but what they're finding is you've still got to take really tough decisions. They're not doing anything. In fact, they're accentuating and reinforcing the path the country was already on, with high tax, high spend, failure to control immigration. Tories, at least, we were trying to push back against those things. Labour, I don't think, are really going to try that hard.
And all that offers opportunity for the Tory party.
It does.
In 4 or 5 years' time, doesn't it?
It offers a huge opportunity if we can create clear blue water. But we've got to be able to say, and it involves disavowing our own record slightly, I'm afraid. Things
saying
went
sorry
wrong.
for things that went wrong, right?
Things went wrong. We got some of those things wrong. We now need to do what we know is good for a country, which is get tax spending down, a smaller state and an effective state. Power that comes on when you turn the light on. Proper control of the borders, an end to the endless sort of regulation and control, judge-made law that we saw this morning on equal pay for different work. All these things, we've got to turn it back, or we're heading for a sort of zero to low growth, endless social conflict, and being left behind by history.
Right. I just find, can the Tories win the next election?
We absolutely can.
You can, despite the scale of Labour's win last month.
We absolutely can, because I think 5 years is plenty of time to sort out our own party.
It'll be historic for David Frost.
It will be historic, but I mean, I remember sitting in the Tory conference in 2021, everybody saying to me, Boris is there for good of 10, 15 years.
Yeah, three-term Johnson it was.
Yeah, so, events really count.
They really count.
If we get things in the right order, we can absolutely win.
Okay, look, Lord Frost, David Frost, thank you for joining us today on Chopper's Political Podcast. That's all for this week. And thank you to you for listening and watching wherever you are. I tweet at Christopher Hope on X. Email me, chopper@gbnews.uk. Let me know what you thought about what Lord Frost had to say. If you enjoyed this podcast, David Frost has, please tell your friends. If you really enjoyed it, please leave a 5-star rating and a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and elsewhere. That helps other people find this show. Thank you to the brilliant team of GB News colleagues behind this podcast: Mick Booker, Jeff Marsh, Rebecca Nunes, George McMillan and Keith Bays. But most importantly of all, again, thank you to you for listening. If you want more Chopper in your life, and who doesn't, do catch me during the week on GB News when I pop up with political news and analysis, and at midday on Wednesdays when Parliament is sitting for PMQs Live. And do keep up to date with all our best political reporting on our website, gbnews.com. Until next time though, cheerio!